So I'm going to be talking about family estrangement, meaning estrangement from our families of origin, the families we grew up in. And this issue seems to me to be just very widespread in general in our times, but I've also noticed that it seems to be particularly widespread among those of us who are in the peak living network. And that could be true for any number of different reasons, or it might even just sort of be my imagination that it's particularly common here compared to other places, but it's certainly common in the network. This talk is based on a talk I gave at an open meeting to the Peak Living Network. And for those of you folks who aren't familiar with the Peak Living Network, we periodically, several times a year, have open meetings where people from the public can come, anybody can come, and they always begin with a presentation about some issue related to emotional healing. So, and I'll say a little more at the end of the video about the Peak Living Network and where you can learn still more about it. So when I'm talking about family estrangement, say siblings that we don't speak to or parents that we don't speak to or that won't speak to us. So I'm talking about issues that may be fairly recent in nature. The estrangement is recent, or we may have been estranged for decades. And I'm talking about estrangement where there may have been our choice, where we decided certain people in my family or all of them, it's just not good for me to deal with. I can't have these people in my life. They're causing too much harm. Or it could be that we were pushed out in certain ways, that other people are now refusing to speak to us, or that we've been rejected by the family. And the issues, at least on the surface, can be very overt, or they can be subtler issues that are still really profound in their impacts. So what I mean by that is the cause of the estrangement may be issues like abuse, that we or our siblings were abused by our parents sexually or physically, or with relentless psychological cruelty. Sometimes it's about older siblings who've been chronically injurious to younger siblings. So child abuse is a real issue. Domestic abuse is an issue. Some people who are estranged from their families, it's related to a dynamic with their dad or stepdad, whoever the man was in the home, abusing their mother, and ways that caused all kinds of family divisions and caused one of us ultimately to have to not really be connected to that family, or again, as I said, to be driven out. But then a lot of the issues, and then another really common overt issue is substance abuse. And we have plenty of people in the network who grew up around heavy substance abusers. Sometimes also certain kinds of mental health issues that can really become overwhelming, particularly if there's family denial about the parent or the sibling who's got serious mental health problems. Now, a lot of time when I'm listening to people's stories, I'm really hearing about dynamics that are not as obvious. I'm not saying they're less injurious necessarily, but they're less overt. They're maybe harder to explain to other people. People aren't necessarily going to immediately get on board with why we're alienated from our families. And it can be things, for example, just like chronic invalidation. Like if you come from parents, for example, who just always find a way to kind of shoot down everything you say. They may not even do it in the most overtly cruel ways, but it has in many ways the same effect, that they find a way to make you feel like your feelings aren't really valid, that you should feel something different than you feel, that whenever you have a conflict with someone that you're trying to get emotional support about, they're always in the conversation with you, siding with the other person, like always saying, well, they're probably feeling this, or maybe you upset them, or maybe they mean well, and just all these kinds of comments that make it so they're really like on the other person's side in a sense. And these kinds of dynamics can take a huge toll. And it can be subtler forms of invasiveness, like in the sort of overt category I talked about sexual abuse. Well, in the more subtle category, it can be things like people who always have to be too much in your business. It can be people who get in your head too much and start telling you what you're thinking and telling you what you're feeling. It can be people who get in your stuff. Maybe they read your diaries or invade your life in certain other ways. Show up uninvited, too much poking into your personal life, and not respecting that you have boundaries. I talked about this extensively in the boundary video for the Peak Living Network, about people, for example, who, when you try to set a limit, say, well, I don't want to talk about that, or I don't want to be touched in that way. Don't respect that. They don't say, oh, sorry, and then respect that, but they keep poking at it. They keep pushing the boundary. They put you down for having expressed the need for the boundary. So you get punished, you get retaliated against for asserting a boundary. And so that what's leading you to be estranged from your family can be much more like an accumulation of what you might call smaller things. I don't really think they're that small, but it's kind of what people often think of as kind of smaller things in nature. Then I hear from people whose family really needs them to be a certain way. Rather than like being a good person, being good enough, they need them to strictly follow a certain religion, or they need them to be pursuing a certain kind of career. And in that last one, in some ways, is one of the most common ones that I run into, is people whose parents need them to have certain kinds of what the parents consider measures of success, and that you have to have a really big income, and you have to live in a certain kind of home, and live in a certain kind of neighborhood, and that they're very, very concerned with social status and how things look publicly, and that kind of takes over from other things. And that's, if you're someone who, you don't want to live that way, you don't have big material ambitions, or you don't like the corporate ladder, or you're an artist and really want to pursue creative things in life, whatever, I'm just throwing out various kinds of examples, why you're not interested in the traditional version of success, then you end up getting this message from your family repeatedly that you're just not good enough, that you're just not doing it right, and that you're not quite meeting with their approval because you won't live the way they want to live. And we do have people in the network who've had great tensions because they don't adhere to certain religious beliefs, or because they have different political beliefs from the people that they come from. And the issue isn't that there are differences. We could have religious differences. We could have political belief differences. The problem is that when the family can't tolerate that, when they can't continue to respect you despite those differences, have to be constantly pressuring you to be like them, and to some extent or another are really rejecting you for not being like them, or are deliberately constantly throwing that stuff in your face, which you just get sick of after a while, that they constantly have to throw their religion at you or throw their political beliefs at you, knowing perfectly well that you don't share them or don't entirely share them. And then a couple of other things that I want to highlight. One is just a sense that some people struggle with, the message that they're getting from their family, that they're not meeting the family's needs enough. So like a parent who is making you feel guilty for ways that you're not available enough to the parent. It's a reversal, really, of parent-child responsibility, where the parent is making the child responsible for his or her well-being, and trying to make you feel bad that you don't come home enough, or trying to make you feel bad if you're not willing to endlessly listen to them whine about the same things that they've been whining about for many, many years, or because you want to have a life of your own, and you're going to move away, or you have various ways that you're going to choose to make what's good for you a priority. And then if you have a partner or you have children, you start to make what you believe is good for them one of your priorities. And some families will just endlessly make you feel bad for not taking care of them. And it's not your responsibility. It's your responsibility to be decent and respectful. And obviously we need to show up at certain key things, 80th birthdays and somebody being in the hospital. But it's not our responsibility to somehow give our lives up to meet the previous generation's needs. And another one is that I've seen create tremendous tensions is parents who are enablers. And so you have a sibling who's got really serious issues, maybe it's got substance abuse problems, or repeatedly just runs up debts and never puts his or her life together in any kind of way, and the parents keep bailing them out, and that can start to create so much tension through the whole family. And then I think the last one I'll mention for now, and I think I've given really enough examples so you get a flavor of what I'm talking about, but I'll just mention for now favoritism. Very, very divisive in families, a very painful thing to be around when you, even if you're the favored child, actually, it can be very, very painful to be around, but we tend to notice it more when someone else is the favored child, and they're getting more attention, they're getting more approval, they're getting often more financial support, more excuses are being made for them where they're not making excuses for us. And that can be another cause sometimes of why we just have to have distance, or why we refuse to be quiet about certain things, so the family ends up distancing us. So next, I find that when the decision is yours, when it's ours, when we're the ones deciding to pull away from our families, we do not get there easily. Nobody wants estrangement from the family they grew up in. And usually by the time the decision gets made of like, I have to have way less to do with these people, or I have to have nothing to do with these people, there have been years, often many years, of efforts to try to get certain issues addressed, to try to get our boundaries respected, to try to find ways to connect through our differences. And so no one arrives at the decision to pull way back unless they've been through a lot, and unless they finally feel like there's just no alternative, that I can't continue with these people without it being too high a cost for my life. Like their toxicity just creeps way too much into my life. So a few dynamics I want to highlight here. One is that can lead us to give up. One is that they seem to hear what we're saying, and they may even apologize for stuff, but nothing changes. Like they just keep doing this stuff that we're saying really needs to stop. Another one is where they're really clearly attached to continuing to behave the way they want to behave. They just defend it. And we're not going to pry them loose from that. At a certain point, we come to accept that. And then the third category is where we get openly retaliated against if we raise certain kinds of issues or ask for what we really want or need. They get us back for it, usually through all different kinds of little verbal dropped sarcastic comments, and making it like your family is your victim because you stood up to them and asked for what you need. Like somehow that's victimizing them. And this is an unhealthy dynamic that arises in a lot of other kinds of situations in life also, where you try to get something stopped that's unacceptable to you. So the person flips it and makes it sound like by demanding that, or by setting that limit, you somehow are being unkind to them. And they'll often say that you're being unkind to them by not letting them continue to stomp on your boundaries. So those are all examples of reasons why we may decide, I'm going to have to stay away from these people. I just can't do it. So looking at sort of this process before we've given up, let's say, of trying to raise issues with our families and trying to get them addressed. So a really common dynamic that you may well have had to live with is in families where there are certain kinds of patterns, whether it's alcoholism or drug addiction, whether it's abuse, whether it's domestic violence, all different kinds of unhealthy dynamics, that everyone is very wounded by what has happened over these years. But their responses to those wounds can vary tremendously. And the most common response, it seems to me, to those wounds is to have to, on some emotional level, convince themselves that those things aren't happening. And they don't have the emotional resources, they don't have the support system to face what's happening, so they deny it. And I don't just mean they verbally deny it, there's some of that, but that they really deny it inside themselves. They they convince themselves that it's not happening. So then when one family member starts demanding that the family address mom's alcoholism, or start to address how mean and selfish dad is, or start to address that an older sibling keeps being in and out of jail, or whatever the things are that nobody seems to want to talk about, the family often will pull together and make the person who's raising the issue the bad one. The kind of kill the messenger approach. Like, you're bad for talking this way about us, or you're just making everything very unpleasant. You're causing tensions. These are the kinds of lines that get said to the family member who tries to wave the flag and say, we've got a really serious problem here. And so that may be a dynamic that you've had to live with sometimes. And it's not that they're carefully examining what you're raising and telling you that they actually have a different opinion from you about what's going on. And that could happen too, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a place where you can tell they're just not willing to look. It's not that they've sort of in some kind of measured, serious, emotionally honest way looked at it and said that they think it's not happening, or it's your issue. So I just made a reference to this a couple of minutes ago, but I want to underline the fact that people's pain about how this family pattern has harmed them is very often precisely why they have to insist that it's not there and that you're the bad one. And you'll get, for example, in families where mom has been abused by her partner, by dad or stepdad, or whoever her partner is, very often it's the siblings in the family who've been most badly wounded by, let's call him dad, who've been most badly wounded by dad, who become most insistent that there's nothing wrong with him, that it was all mom's fault, that you've just made this up, all these kinds of things. And that's a kind of bitter irony to recognize that this is actually often the product of their emotional wounds. These are the patterns that have resulted from how badly they got hurt. But sometimes the understanding of that can just help you feel at least a little bit better. And it's not going to help you feel a lot better, but it can help a little when you're able to look at that and think, well, this is because in some ways these people got crushed by what happened even worse than I did. And that's why they can't bring themselves to look at it, and why it's easier to make me the bad guy. So a couple of thoughts about family estrangement in the context of the Peak Living Network, or in any other, it could be in a group of friends or in any other kind of supportive, or we hope supportive, community or network. So I was saying how no one makes the decision lightly to cut themselves off, or partly cut themselves off from their family. So in the Peak Living Network, it's very important that we not take stands with each other on what one another should do. So specifically, I'm asking you, please don't ever tell anyone in the network that they should be cutting relations with their family members. And please don't ever tell them that they should not be cutting relationships with their family members. And I've already watched this dynamic, both of those, play out some in the Peak Living Network. That temptation to live out our issues through other people, or to have other people solve problems that we need to solve, is a powerful one. And to tell someone, oh, you don't want to lose your family, you need your family in your life, you don't want to be without your family, is to severely dismiss and invalidate what they're trying to tell you when they're about how high the price has been, and that we have every reason to respect their decision that the price has become too high. And I'll say here that I've known so many people over the years where it was such a relief to them. They ended up, if anything, wishing they had taken the step sooner. It was such a relief to them to back way off or back out completely. And it led to their life improving in so many different ways. One of the fundamental principles of healing, and this is one many of you have undoubtedly heard me talk about, is that it's extremely different difficult to heal from something that has not stopped happening. You can heal a little bit while it continues to happen, but you don't tend to be able to heal very much or very well unless you can get away from the source of harm. And so when you're moving, into adulthood and you're starting to have a lot more choices and control over your life, and these behaviors from your family of origin are just not stopping, that's keeping you from being able to do the kind of healing and personal growth that you want to do. And that means we have to respect that in each other. That means when someone else says, like, it's not good for me to be around this anymore, we really need to respect that and support that and not do the whole, you've got to have your family thing. But the other end of the spectrum isn't any better. To tell someone, why do you put up with this? Don't let them pull this stuff on you. You should cut you off from them. They're the ones who know how high the price is that they're paying. And they also know what they would pay to give it up. Like sometimes they have a parent that they don't want to just leave to die, who has a chronic health problem, while that parent continues to be really terrible to them. Well, we need to respect that decision. Why they wouldn't just say, okay, well, I'm going to leave my parent there to die. And I'm using a somewhat extreme example, except I've known people who were in precisely that situation. So it's not an exaggeration of what circumstances some people find themselves in. So you let go, if you can, of your judgments about each other's decisions and just try to be there and try to remember the kinds of things that I talked about in this presentation today about how interwoven and complex and powerful the issues are here and how very, very hard these decisions are to make. Forgive yourselves, forgive each other, and believe that we all can find a path to healing for ourselves with each other's support. So then the next issue that connects in here is it's not always all or nothing. So sometimes someone decides, and I get it, and I'm behind you, I just have to have nothing to do with these people. Or at least there's one or more people in my family I got to have nothing to do with. I've tried everything. But sometimes if you're very reluctant to do that, or you really feel like that's too much of a loss, you can consider, or at least experiment with, a middle ground where you back way off from people, you discipline yourself to stop opening up to them about anything that's going to make you vulnerable to them. You make them much less central in your life. You visit them a lot less often. You call or text a lot less often, but you don't completely cut all contact. There's reasons why that will sometimes work well, and there are reasons why it will not, but it's often worth a try, let's say. One of the risks of doing it that way is that when we have really toxic family members in our lives, it's very, very hard to give up the hope that they will change. And we can hit our heads against the wall for 20 years when it's so clear that they're not going to change, because it's so hard to accept that they won't. And in that circumstance, it really tends to be easier to just cut all contact, because if we cut all contact, we start to have an easier time, not an easy time, but an easier time accepting, like, this is just the way it's going to be. Whereas if we continue to have even fairly infrequent contact, that can easily hook us back in again to that hope that somehow something's going to be different. And then pretty soon we're opening up more than we should, or we're making them play a bigger role in our lives than we should. Again, a decision that you can only make for yourself. It's an experiment that's often worth trying to pull back without pulling completely out of the relationship. But you have to decide whether that works at all. And you have to decide whether you have enough, whether you feel like you have enough control over your own decisions that you'll be able to be way back and discipline yourself to stay there. Whereas if you really have a lot of trouble disciplining yourself there, then it's going to tend to be easier to just cut contact. And then the last thing I'll say in this category is that cutting contact doesn't have to be forever. I mean, sometimes it ends up being forever, and that's very sad, but sometimes that's what you got to do. But there are other times when you cut contact with a family member or with the whole family for a year or 2 years or 3 years or some number of years, they start to be willing to make some degree of compromise in order to be back in contact with you and in order to feel like you're part of the family, and in order not to have to admit to their friends and relatives that you're not dealing with them. And so if you do have to just cut, you at least can tell yourself that it won't necessarily have to be forever. It's also, I should say one more thing about that, that taking a few years apart isn't just about the ways that it might lead them to finally be willing to budge a little bit. It also gives you a bunch of space to do some healing and processing, co-counseling if you're doing co-counseling, and that can sometimes make it possible to reconnect with the family much more on your own terms, much more able to refuse to get involved in certain kinds of patterns, much more able to not be dragged down by them, so that you're less likely to leave interactions with them depressed or feeling terrible about yourself. So many people come from families that just specialize in making you feel bad about yourself. And you get a few years away from that and you really solidify your sense of self, and you work on your friendships so that you feel like there are other people who know that you're a good person and aren't out to tear you down. Then sometimes going back can happen much more on your own terms. And whatever you decide about how you're going to handle your relationship with your family, continue doing your own healing work. And anyone who knows me knows that I really encourage people to do co-counseling, but people find other paths. Sometimes professional therapy works for people. Sometimes yoga and meditation and different kinds of mindfulness techniques work for people. In the Peak Living Network, we're not judgmental about what your healing path is. I'm a personal promoter of co-counseling because I think it's a uniquely powerful healing approach. But there's so many other paths that people have found helpful. The point I'm making now is whatever you decide to do about your family, which can really help you today, it's not going to heal the harm that they did 5 years ago or 40 years ago. And so whatever you decide, make sure you also continue to attend to what you need in order to be healing from the things that happened. So when I gave this talk a few months ago that I'm finally recording on video, we had a bunch of people there and we had a discussion afterwards. And so I want to finish with just a few points that were raised by Peak Living Network people who were at the talk that day. One is that you can have people in your family who insist on acting as if everything's fine when things are really messed up, including when you're really angry at them or have really backed way off from them. Just if they do talk to you, they just talk like nothing has changed in your relationship. And so that's, of course, going to be really upsetting to have people just pretending like everything's fine. Another really important point, these are all really important points, but that someone was brought up was that it's really sad, even if it's the right decision to back off or to cut family members off altogether, there's still tremendous grief there. That's not what you wanted. And of course they may lay that on you. Oh, so this is what you want. When it's not what you want. You want to be treated the way you want to be treated, or you want somebody else in the family treated the way they deserve to be treated. And it's the refusal for those changes to happen that's leading you to back off. So understand the grief in yourself, make space for working on that grief and healing it. But again, it's also something we really need to understand with each other. So if someone's saying, I'm so sad about being disconnected from my family, and we say, well, you have the choice to be back in contact with them. That's not an answer. That's not helpful. It has nothing to do with the realities of their situation. They need to stay away, and they need our love and support about how sad that is that they have to do that. So the grieving is a really powerful dynamic. Another one. Sometimes there's someone in the family, and it might be you. I think in the Peak Living Network, it's often the person in the Peak Living Network. There's someone in the family who's just too well. And they're stepping out of certain really, really toxic family dynamics. They're living a different kind of life, and the family can't stand that. Even if you're not confronting them that much, even if you're not really challenging them that much about how they're living or what kind of condition they're in, they still just become too aware, probably largely on an unconscious level, that you're too well, that you've stepped out of certain family patterns, that you're not down in the hole with them. And they can become really resentful towards you about that. That's not how they're going to look at it. That's not how they're going to describe it. They're usually going to just find things to pick about you or pretend that you're somebody other than who you are, some excuse to speak really badly about you with each other and also to you. And so that's just a possibility that's worth looking at, is the problem here that I've gotten too well for these folks. I'm not encouraging you to feel superior or above them. That's not what I mean. I don't want that. I don't believe in superiority, but I'm talking about a way to help yourself feel better about what's happened by recognizing that maybe you just got into good shape that's beyond what your family members can handle. That they can't handle having someone that's doing that well and that has stepped outside of their really toxic loops. Another person talked about how in society we tend to feel somewhat embarrassed or even ashamed of the fact that we've had to cut ourselves off from our family. There's a stigma to having this alienation from your family, and a kind of assumption that must say something about you, not just something about your family. And so that embarrassment is hard. I've noticed that there's a tendency to kind of congratulate people who are really close to their families of origin, as if somehow they accomplished that. Well, maybe they did. Sometimes they did tremendous healing work to make it possible. But sometimes they're just lucky. Sometimes they just come from a family where people treat each other better. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't celebrate it. We should certainly celebrate their closeness to their family. That's different from congratulating them for it. The reason I would prefer that you not congratulate them for it is because if they're doing something good by staying close to their family, then somebody else is doing something bad by not being close to their family, and I don't want us to look at it that way. So celebrate it as good fortune rather than as something somehow to be proud of or good about them, unless we are giving them appreciation for specific efforts that we think they've put out to make that happen. That's different. If it's like, oh, I just so appreciate how you've worked on your relationship with your relatives, or I so appreciate what a high priority you make your family. That's different. If we're appreciating about something that's really what they've done, then that's a great thing. And then one other person talked about just kind of hidden dynamics in families. How sometimes there's someone who kind of pulls the strings in a family where that's not identified. You may be starting to identify it, but other people in the family don't. And that the exercise of power is not always done in overt and visible ways. There can be lots of manipulation going on. There can be a lot of sowing of divisions. Sowing of divisions is really important. In some families, you have some serious splitters, people who are really good at getting everybody else turned against each other. And in my book, The Joyous Recovery, which is kind of like the basis in some ways for the Peak Living Network, not that everybody in PLN has read it, but I'm saying it forms a kind of core set of text, a core text, a sort of set of concepts for the network. I talk some about some of these issues in family dynamics, and so that one I go into some in the Joyous Recovery. So I said I would finish by just saying a couple things about the Peak Living Network. We're a support organization. We're almost entirely free. Almost everything we do is free. That may have to change over time because we're not really quite staying afloat financially, but that's for anyone who's pursuing any form of emotional healing and who just wants to get additional support. We ask people to come to the network with a give and take mentality. Like, this isn't a place to just come to get support. because we're completely peer run. There's no one here is in any professional role. We do have some people who are therapists in the network just because that's what they have to do for a living, but they're not with us acting as therapists. In the Peak Living Network, we're all looking out for each other. So we ask people to come with the mentality that I'm going to be giving and receiving in equal measure. And then I periodically teach co-counseling, a particular healing approach that I really love, that I do through the Peak Living Network. So on this channel, you can find lots of other videos about the Peak Living Network, some basic explanations of what we are, an orientation to how we work, basic information about co-counseling if that approach to healing interests you, or if you just want to learn even what it is. And so that there's a whole lot of information. And then there's a bunch of videos that are really for people who are learning co-counseling. Those are generally going to work better if you're taking a class at the same time. But there are ways to work with those videos and the Peak Living Network co-counseling manual, the healing partnership, to learn by yourself if you don't have access to a class or just don't have time to do that. So my warm thoughts and wishes to everybody who's dealing with these issues in family estrangement. And I hope that this video just really helps you know have some ideas about where to go with it, some concepts that might just help to ease the pain of it all a little. And above all, I really hope this video helps us be more sensitive and aware with each other as we're supporting one another about these issues.